Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Paul Holes, host of Oxygen's upcoming series, The DNA of Murder with Paul Holes.
So are you guys having fun here at CrimeCon? I think we're going to have some fun here over the next hour. You know, I've got this show coming out on Oxygen called The DNA of Murder. That's why the title of this particular segment is called The DNA of Murder. I worked closely with Wilshire Productions to try to develop the concept for this show to reflect the way that I approach cases, whether they're active cases or cold cases. And I look into cases from, of course, the forensic, the investigative, and the behavioral aspects. And so this show is going to be me going around the country working with law enforcement on their unsolved cases, hoping that a collaborative effort between me and law enforcement, me and the victims' families, will be able to finally get resolution to some of these cases. And of course, we're going to talk about the cases as we do this active investigation for each episode. With this event right now, I'm going to give you an introduction into how I initially start taking a look at a case. And this is going to be somewhat interactive. You know, I've got a crime scene. I always start with the crime scene. I want to know what happened. Everything about a case manifests itself out of the crime scene. This is where the offender, the victim, and in an environment all interacted for the crime to occur. You have to understand what happened, and that will guide the investigation. Of course, you find forensic evidence at the crime scene. You get your DNA, you get your latents, you get your trace, you get your shoe impressions, etc. But you also get insight into the offender's mind. This is where the profilers come into play, because that's what they are reading. And that's something that I read as I take a look at these crime scenes to try to figure out, well, who do I think the offender is likely to be? Because when you first respond out to a case, you have the universe in front of you. But eventually, you have to focus in on what you think is the right direction in order to solve the case. So my goal over the next hour, over the next 50 minutes, is to walk you through a mock crime scene. This is a crime scene that I just set up. It is not a real life case, but it's been inspired by several cases that I've had involvement in over the years. And it's here to be somewhat instructional as I kind of process with you going through this space. I am going to ask questions of the audience. You know, if you guys want to respond, we have a person that will be running around with a mic. It'll only be one person for one question, just because obviously we've got a large group here and we have to keep going in order to get through this within the next 50 minutes. But this is going to be something where let's just kind of have fun with it and go with it. Now, as we go through, and I need to take a look at this crime scene right now to make sure it's configured the way that I want it to be configured. And they actually did a very good job. But first I want to kind of address sort of a definition, because you'll hear me. You know, we talk about victims, that's self-explanatory. We've got the scene, whether it's an indoor space, could be a residence, it could be a commercial space, or an outdoor space. You know, we're out in the middle of the woods. That is a scene, that's the environment in which the crime occurred. But on shows that have already aired, as well as how I end up talking, I use the term offender. And people are sometimes confused by that term. Most people hear the term suspect. Well, the problem with using the term suspect is that is a named individual that law enforcement has said this person has enough information, enough circumstantial evidence, etc., to where we suspect that person of having involvement in the crime. You have weak suspects, you have strong suspects, but they are an actual person. Versus when I respond out to a crime scene, and I'm taking a look at this space right here, I don't know who that person is. I don't know who the suspects are. But I know that there is an entity an offender that committed a crime in this space. An offender is a genderless, almost like a virtual entity. It's an individual, a virtual individual that committed the crime. And then as I pursue the investigation, that's when now suspects start getting developed, because now I'm getting names. So that's how you see it. Of course, out in the online community, you hear the POIs, the persons of interest. Very few law enforcement agencies use that term. So you'll hear me say offender, and hopefully everybody understands why I use that term now. So when you initially respond to a crime scene, and I'm not going to get into how crime scenes are processed, you know, all the documentation that occurs, all the evidence collection. But what I want to emphasize is that when somebody is rolling out to a crime scene, and we may have crime scene investigators in this audience, is you got to get into the mindset of doing more than just capturing photos and collecting the evidence. If you're going to be a crime scene investigator, you are contributing to the investigation because you have specialized expertise to be able to interpret the evidence and how that impacts how the crime occurred, and be able to pass that information on to an investigator. And I've worked in both worlds. I've worked as a crime scene investigator, I've worked as an investigator, and it is an ongoing communication as the investigation proceeds, as the crime scene is being processed. This case that we have before you, it's a double homicide. It's in a hotel room. We have a male victim found on the bed. He's deceased. We have a female victim that is on the floor between the bed and the kitchen, or not the kitchen, but the bathroom. What you will be seeing me do is, as I go through this, I've got a cameraman here who, as I'm just talking generally, will probably be scanning the space, but when I point out certain areas within this space, he's going to zoom in on those areas so you can see exactly what I'm seeing within this crime scene. In order to be able to understand what happened, you have to understand what happened to the victims. This is where the autopsy comes into play. In this case here, this is a mock crime scene. This is just a created space. The victims will be processed at the crime scene, then they go to the coroner's office and a pathologist will do the autopsy. That is critical information for me. The pathologist's findings allows me to now take a look at, okay, I've got blood patterns in the scene. How am I going to attribute the creation of these blood patterns relative to the bleeding injuries that were documented at autopsy? So the first step in terms of assessing a case is saying, okay, what happened to the victims? In this particular case, we have a male victim. He's laying face down. He's got a single blow to the back of his head. At autopsy, that single blow is consistent with something similar to a hatchet or an axe. Right next to his body, we have a hatchet. It's been laid there by the offender. Now, if we were to take a look at this right now, we have the blow to the back of the head, and if we take a look at the headboard, you'll notice that there's no blood spatter on the headboard. Can somebody tell me why there isn't any blood spatter on that headboard?
Because it's not where he was struck.
It's not where he was struck. One of the things to understand about blood patterns, especially when you're dealing with spatter, spatter is created when you have impact to a pooled blood source. You have to have that pooled blood source. If I were to take a baseball bat and strike somebody in the head as hard as I could, am I going to produce blood spatter? No. Probably could kill the person. But once that person's down and I strike again in that same spot, now you get the blood spatter, right? So when you see a spatter pattern from an impact to a pooled blood source, minimally, how many blows occurred in order to produce that spatter pattern? At least 2. When you look at our male victim, he's got a single blow to the back of his head with a hatchet. Fatal injury, he's deceased, laying face down on the bed, but no blood spatter. It's easily accounted for. It's very critical to understand that as I go through this, that when you start talking about reconstructing the events at a crime scene, you can only reconstruct those events that left interpretable evidence. You imagine, basically all of you guys coming into this room today is like a person who's entering a house to commit a crime. And then you walk through the space, you sit down on the chairs, you get up and you walk out. How can I, as a crime scene investigator, coming in hours after that, reconstruct your movements through this space? Not really. However, if you do something that leaves evidence of an action that you took, now I can actually see that and interpret it. And so I liken this to sitting in a dark room watching a play, right? And you can't see anything going on on stage. And then all of a sudden there's a strobe light that goes off, and you see the actors on stage for that brief split second, but then it goes dark again. That is what happens in crime scene reconstruction. So when I am looking at blood patterns up on the wall, that's where I've got that strobe light going off saying, I've got this type of pattern that occurred in this space. I can interpret that. But do I have evidence to show me what happened before or after that particular action occurred within the commission of the crime? So what you're going to see as I walk through this is starting to interpret the events based on the blood patterns. Now, we've talked about the male and his autopsy result. It looks like he's probably face down, whether he's asleep or he has been ordered on the bed, and a single blow to the back of his head. At this point, we have no other movements, no other blood patterns in this particular scenario from the male victim. All the other blood, based on the forensic testing that I'm just going to say has been done at this point, comes back to the female victim. So now we have blood patterns distributed throughout this room. In order to understand those blood patterns, we have to understand, well, what bleeding injuries does she have? So now, this is again where the pathologist's findings become critical. Turns out that our female victim in this case has multiple stab wounds. She's got defensive injuries to her hands and her arms. She's got stab wounds to the back of her head as well as her upper back. And then she has stab wounds to her upper chest and neck area. So she's got a lot of bleeding injuries going on. Now, when you take a look at those injuries, imagine, most of you have probably cut a finger in your life, right? And so now you've got a bleeding injury in which blood is dripping. What happens when you fling your arm while that blood is dripping? You get cast-off patterns. However, these stab wounds to the head, the upper body, you really can't fling your upper body, but they're going to bleed. You're going to get saturated clothing. So when you get pressed up against a surface, you could have what are called contact transfers. If you have a lot of blood in your hair, you get these hair wipes, and you can actually see the hair outlines. So you can start to use these blood patterns in order to position the victim at various points during her interaction with the offender. In this case, if we were to come around, we're going to start sort of at the end and work our way backwards. We have the female victim laying face up. She's been covered by a sheet from the bed. She's got numerous stab wounds to her upper chest, her neck area, and we have spatter immediately above her. What does that tell me about what's going on with her laying here? Anybody want to answer that question?
She was fighting back.
Say that again?
She was fighting back.
She's fighting back. Now we've got her laying down, and there's no question she's fighting in this scenario. But at this point, what I've got is I've got stab wounds to the upper chest and neck, and I've got the spatter that's going up onto that doorway immediately above her. This is showing that she's receiving multiple stab wounds at that location while she's down. And what you get is you get a combination of cast off from the knife as it gets bloody over and over again. On the upswing, you get blood drops being cast off. But also, once you get that pooled blood source and that knife is going in, you can get small amount of spatter as a result. The other thing you have to take into account is human anatomy. When you start penetrating, for example, the lungs with a knife, and you start getting blood inside the lungs, inside the trachea, and that victim is trying to breathe, you get expiratory patterns. And so now you start to see fine droplets being deposited up above where the victim is at, as well as raining down on her. Absolutely horrific to think what these victims would go through under those circumstances. Now, working our way backwards. She's down. It appears that she's receiving multiple stab wounds at this position. This is where she dies, right? She is no longer moving after this point. But we have blood stains all around. In fact, on the bed, what we can see are her blood based on DNA testing with spatter patterns on the headboard as well as on this side of the bed. Then we have an area in which we have large transfers with hair wipes. Where's that blood coming from? Back of her head. What is this telling us about her interaction with the offender in this little tiny corner between the table and that wall? So she's down on the bed. Appears that she starts receiving some bleeding injuries while she's on the bed. Now, as the bleeding starts to basically saturate her clothing, saturate her hair, she now has a struggle going on in that corner. Yet you see the differences. We have some transfers, large blood patterns up high and down low. It's showing her change of position. There's a combat going on between the offender and the victim at this location. She's up, she's down. We have a dripped blood trail on the carpet down here, kind of coming out towards this chair. We have blood smears on the top of the table, as well as handprints, bloody handprints on the wall. There's a lot of information going on within this very confined area. Our offender is interacting with our victim, but he's struggling to take control. She's up, she's down, she's trying to get away. She has defensive injuries, incisive wounds to her hands as she's grasping at surfaces or grabbing the wall. She's leaving blood transfers. So these are those strobe lights that I told you about. You can start to piece together the events and possibly the logical progression from the time that she's receiving bleeding injuries when she's on the bed, as she's struggling to get away from the offender and fighting with the offender, to ultimately she's laying down and she loses her life on the floor. So that's how, from just looking at blood patterns, you can start to reconstruct activities within the crime scene. And quite frankly, blood patterns are one of the best forms of evidence to reconstruct those types of events. You know, a little goofy thing that I do, you know, standing in the shower, you got the steam shower going on, and the glass on the shower doors are all steamed up. You got water on your hands, just sit there and start flicking the water against those shower doors to see what kind of patterns you create. And obviously water is different than blood. Blood is more viscous, but you know what? You start to see how you can change the patterns just by doing that simple experiment. So how many people, the next time you take a shower, so when you get in this space, and I'm going to contaminate this crime scene a little bit, I'm going to move this out to here. This is a trash can that ended up having some papers that are burned. When crime scene investigators first respond out to a crime scene, one of their priorities is to actually photograph the crime scene as it is at the time that they walk in. Law enforcement is trained that once they've determined that there's no other lives at risk, this is now a homicide scene, they lock it down and preserve it in its native state. However, the offender left, probably from this case, many, many hours before. I need to know what alterations have occurred to this crime scene between the time that the offender left and the time that the photographs were taken in that crime scene. Imagine paramedics thinking that they have living victims in this space. Are they concerned at all about the physical evidence or about crime scene reconstruction? Not at all. Paramedics will come in here, they'll throw everything out of the way, they'll turn the victims' bodies over, they'll check for vital signs. They will take a scene. It could be a homicide scene. They can make it look like a suicide, or a suicide scene and make it look like a homicide, because their goal is to preserve life, and you can't blame them for that. At the same time, you have to understand, well, who found the bodies? Was it loved ones? Did they do anything to alter the scene? Sometimes they'll come up and hug their loved one that's now deceased at the crime scene. Initial responding officers will come in, and they will change the crime scene. So when I am first digging into the crime scene aspect, I have to know who found the body, what did the first responders do, and I have to take into account those potential alterations. In this particular case, this scene was discovered because a smoke detector went off. So now you got the smoke alarm going on, and you have the hotel manager coming in, and the trash can, which was alight, set on fire, was right up against the drapes. So of course that person moves this trash can away so the hotel doesn't burn down. But it becomes important to understand that you have that kind of alteration. Now, when you take a look at this crime scene, what kind of stands out to you in that something that the offender did? I heard it. Victim number one. What is that offender trying to tell us?
There'll be a victim number two.
Say it again?
There'll be more victims.
There'll be more victims. He is now saying, I'm a serial killer, right? Victim number one, there's going to be more. And it's written in such a way to be very apparent to anybody entering this space. Does anybody see any contradictions going on in this space?
Why are there two?
Well, why not victim two? Okay, and that is a good point. Because imagine an offender coming in, and he wants to kill this couple. Part of what has to occur is taking a look at the offender's behaviors with each of the victims in this crime scene. So with the male, in essence, you have single blow to the back of the head. Male is taken out, offender drops the hatchet. Now the offender is turning the attention to the female. Is the offender showing a lot of emotions, a lot of anger towards the male? Very clinical. This was an elimination. You eliminate the threat, right? Also tells me that there's probably not a personal connection between the offender and the male. This was literally just to it's almost an MO thing. Get the male out of the way so I can now turn my attention to the female. Notice where victim number 1 is written relative to the female's body. Is that significant? Is victim number 1 the male? Victim number 1 is the female. What does it mean when victims are covered up? Something personal, right? There could be something personal, or they could be showing remorse. They're having a hard time looking at what they did. That's very, very significant in terms of assessing the offender's relationship to the victim. The male's not covered up. He's exposed. He's got the blow to the back of his head, but you know what? There doesn't appear to be a personal connection between the offender and that male victim. But there does seem to be a personal connection with the offender and the female. When you're dealing with predatory types of offenders, you rarely see them cover their victims up. Oftentimes, what you see, especially victims that they are taking into their vehicle, let's say the sex workers that they end up taking into their vehicle, killing somewhere, and then they discard their bodies on the side of a road or somewhere else. The only covering up they do is to try to hide the body. There isn't that personal connection where they're trying to show, I can't look at this, and they don't want to see it anymore. But generally, predators are not going to cover their victims up like what we see in this particular case. Sequencing is also a big deal when you start talking about crime scenes. And sequencing can occur when you're taking a look at how blood patterns overlap with each other, or just common sense stuff. So maybe if we take a look at the shoes on the ground over here, what are we seeing? We've got a pair of men's shoes, and then we have a wallet. The wallet has been emptied out. What does that tell us about the sequence of events? Shoes were there first, the wallet was emptied out, placed on top after that. When you start to see items being stolen, like money, jewelry, does that necessarily mean that the crime itself is absolutely financially motivated? No. It can be due to financial opportunity. The offender has taken control of the situation. He sees a source of cash, goes, I'm going to take that. See it all the time. But it also could be, I'm going to make it look like something it's not. I want people coming in to think I came here because I wanted money. So there's a form of what we call staging. Now, from a sequencing standpoint, remember we had that trash can with paper that was set on fire. What's the offender trying to do with that? Go ahead.
Destroy evidence?
Okay. So if he's trying to destroy evidence, is he setting this place on fire early in this event or towards the end?
I'd say afterwards.
It's probably his last action, right? When does he write victim number 1? Before then. And he ends up using the victim's bra, and if we can see on the floor over here, probably took the victim's bra out of the suitcase, dipped it in her own blood, and then wrote victim number 1 up here. We have a chair that's been pulled back at the foot of the bed. We have a man's wallet, keys, a cell phone that are on the ground, with the wallet being on top of the shoes. Appears that maybe the offender possibly sat down in that chair while he's going through stuff. He's not doing that probably while the victims are alive. So it's sequencing events. And then at the very end, he is now writing, or he's now trying to burn the place down. So let's think about this for a second. And now we're kind of digging into the behavioral aspects of what's going through the offender's mind. He does a clinical kill of the male, and then he goes to interact with the female. The female puts up a fight, and it's probably a much bigger fight than what was expected based on the movements of her, the bleeding of her, and where she ultimately ends up. You think that the offender gets rattled as a result of that? These guys, I mean, they talk about being cold-blooded killers, but the reality is they're going into these cases, they're nervous, they're stimulated. They are amped up. And when things go sideways on them, some of them do not respond very well to that. And so they get frazzled. And at the end, that's when they start making some of these mistakes that become interpretable. So if this guy is trying to portray himself as this blossoming serial killer, victim number 1, and he's displaying that for everybody who's entering this room in plain sight, what about covering that victim up? What do you think about that? Anybody have thoughts?
He was related to this person?
He was what?
Related to this person?
Was related
Maybe it was
to the
his
person?
wife?
Or he has like a personal connection because of the covering up. But what about victim number 1? I'm a serial killer versus, we have somebody down here.
I don't think that any of it is real. I think it's all staged. I think the whole victim thing is...
Okay.
I think it's about killing that person, and the victim, the serial killer thing is just the staged.
A staging. So what does it mean when somebody stages? I briefly talked about that. We have some people back there. That is a very important concept to understand, and it's very real, and it happens more frequently than what you realize.
So it's making the crime scene look like it's something other than it is, and like the contradictory evidence of victim number 1 saying, I want everyone to see this, there's going to be a number 2, versus setting the hotel room on fire, destroying everything. What's that with?
It's contradiction, right?
Right.
So he's trying to make it look like victim number 1, I'm a serial killer, yet the victim is covered up, showing sort of that personal connection. Appears to be contradictory. Anytime I walk into a scene and I start to see something that is contradictory, that's where I have to step back and go, okay, I need to look at that more closely, because I might be having an offender who is staging. He's trying to make the crime look like something it's not. Now, why does somebody stage a crime scene?
Well, because they don't want to be caught, but because they want to obviously send you in a different direction.
Yes.
And one of the things I wanted to say, and I'm not sure what you're saying is he wants the place to burn down. But to me, I want to say that it may be that he knows it's not going to burn down, because if it does, then victim number 1 on that door is useless.
Well, I think in part you've got a good observation there. But first with the staging, it's all about misdirection. And anytime somebody stages a crime scene, they're trying to push the investigation as far away from them as possible. So if he's writing victim number 1, I'm a serial killer. Is he? He's betraying himself by covering the victim, saying, I can't stand to look at what I just did to somebody I know. That's a good question. How do we know he's a man? I'm going to address that. But first, let's address the fire. So we're seeing he took the time to write this victim number 1 up on the wall. He wants people to see that. But if the fire is successful, are people going to see that? Contradiction.
I would check the relationships of each of these and see if it's if they have another relationship going on and caught them in the hotel.
So victimology.
Yes.
Victimology is huge. And that's part of the investigative phase in terms of when you start assessing the crime scene. Of course, part of any investigation is knowing who the victims are. That's all right. We're all having fun here, right? But knowing who the victims are and what's going on in their lives, who they're interacting with, becomes very, very important. And this is where interpreting the crime scene becomes significant. Because when you first come in, the entire universe is at your disposal in terms of suspect pool. And you become very ineffective and very inefficient if you don't have a direction that you think you should be going down. But when you interpret this crime scene, and as I'm looking at this crime scene, I'm seeing the contradiction. I'm seeing, ooh, serial killer, but no. I'm remorseful about what I did to the female victim. Even though I took the time to write victim number 1, I want to burn this place down because I don't want to get caught. I want to destroy the evidence. But then I'm eliminating the message that I want to send to the people who are responding.
That's where the sequencing comes in, because maybe they started the fire and it went catch or something, and then they're like, this isn't working.
Right.
So how do you know which happened first?
So the question is this where sequencing comes into play? And yes, absolutely, but sometimes you cannot sequence things definitively based on physical evidence, but you end up using common sense. What is the logical progression? Remember, the hotel manager came into the room and the trash can was on fire, right? So that appears to be the last thing this offender did. He's trying to burn this place down. He does not want to be caught. And I'm using the term he very generically right now. So with this contradiction, now investigatively, from a behavioral standpoint, I'm going, you know what? If this guy's trying to force me to take a look at, I'm this serial predator and this was just a random attack, going, no, it's not. He has a personal relationship with this woman. Who is in her past? What is the relationship between her and the male victim? And starting to assess the victimology, and I could potentially narrow down the suspect pool that would fit. Now, one of the aspects about this case, and this is an unusual case because we have 2 different weapons being used. We have a hatchet that was used on the male that was discarded, but then we have a knife that the offender took away that was used on the female. Somewhat unusual to see 2 weapons being introduced by the offender within the same crime scene, but it does happen. But notice how much movement the female victim was able to do within this space. And granted, it's a small space, but she's moving around. What does that tell us about maybe the physical capabilities between the female and the offender?
What happened is he walked in with the hatchet. The assailant, whatever, walked in with the hatchet, took out the male victim while he was sleeping because he was out for the water.
Here, we have a mic right here for you.
He took out the male because the male could defend himself. And then the female was actually the one that he wanted to see, was actually
The target?
the target, yeah.
Okay. So he's eliminating the male, the larger threat, but now he's turning his attention to the female, but the female's able to fight.
He took out the man because the man could fight back. Whenever he started fighting the woman, they're more evenly matched. She could get away when they were one-on-one. So it might be a female offender who's trying to take out the woman, or a smaller, weaker man. It's not someone real strong.
So that's one of those things, very good. That's one of those things that it's very subjective, but it's something that I am constantly evaluating. You see this over and over again with crimes against women. When you have a very physically dominant male or offender, generally you see that female basically being contained. Once the offender has interacted with that female, that interaction stays in that spot. But when you start to see combat situations where now the victim is able to move and seemingly able to get away at times, and the offender is constantly struggling to contain the victim, now you go, okay, these two combatants appear to be relatively equal in terms of their physical capabilities. Can't say what gender the offender is, but you can start to say, you know what, I'm not dealing with a 6'5", 320-pound NFL lineman with a 5'2" petite female. I'm dealing with an offender that is probably physically on par with the victim. And you have to also take into account the victim psychology in this moment. She's realizing her life's at risk. You have the fight or flight kind of adrenaline kicking in. You get the super strength. There is stuff that also impacts how this interaction goes. But when you start looking at all the cases, and I've seen a lot of these cases, and you start correlating who the offender is physically relative to the victim, you can start to see how that influences the dynamics at the crime scene. I have a case, it's a very high-profile case, in which a relatively well-known media, kind of a talking head in the media, his wife was killed in a mansion in a trailer home while their mansion was being built in my jurisdiction. I walk into that crime scene, and it was a crime scene that basically flowed through this entire living space. This woman struggled, and this struggle occurred for a long period of time. And I told the investigators, the primary investigators on the case, I said, this is not a robust offender. This is somebody who is going to be relatively small and relatively weak. And it turned out to be a teenage boy living in the area. So you can get insight based on assessing that type of movement pattern. And it looks like we have some questions over here. Okay, we'll let you ask.
It's common just to get into a hotel room.
Right.
It would be somebody letting somebody in unless they worked in the building or had access to a key.
And that's a good point in terms of, okay, so we have an offender that's gaining access. It appears the male is either ordered on the bed or asleep. So now we have somebody who's coming into this space probably very quickly and silently. Do we have any locksmiths in the audience? One of the things that you have to take into consideration, law enforcement, we use the term no signs of forced entry. That means that there was no physical evidence that there had been force applied in order to gain access, but doesn't mean that somebody had the ability to break into the space without leaving evidence. And there are people that have those skill sets. You see that with some of these highly skilled burglars. Do you think some of these burglars will commit homicides? They do. Or you have a ruse situation where something as simple as knocking on the door, housekeeping, and you just go and you open up the door, next thing you know, you're being pushed in, and the door is closed behind. Is there going to be any evidence showing that there had been that forced entry? There isn't. So when we say no signs of forced entry, we're looking for the pry marks around the windows. We're looking for the door kick with the door jamb being smashed open. So that's something to assess as you're looking at the offender. How did that person gain access? Were they somebody that maybe worked at the hotel and had a card key? Happens. Looks like we have a question over here. And our mic person is getting her exercise in. Looks like right back there.
This is just an observation. It looks like from the blood marks that she was actually asleep. He was able to take out the mail very quietly and stab her because she was stabbed in the back of the head. And looks like he was able to stab her in the back of the head first in the bed. And if that, and it may have been that that's what he thought would take her out.
Okay.
And then she fought back. And in that case, if he thought that would take her out, then that was what was unexpected. And yes, it was that he was small in stature.
This turned into a much bigger battle than what was expected by the offender. Now, when the stabbing to the back of the head occurred, could have occurred in the bed, could have occurred while she's up and there's a struggle going on. This is actually modeled after a case in which I had a female offender break through a window in a house, grab a knife out of the kitchen drawer and climb on top of the sleeping female victim and start stabbing her. She wakes up, and now you have a struggle that ensued. So in many ways, that's what I'm modeling in terms of what happened with the female in this particular case. It's what's in the offender's mind. So the question is if the victims are covered up, what significance is that relationship? How significant is that relationship? It's what the offender thinks. So that offender in his mind thinks that he actually has some sort of relationship with that victim. It may be real, it may be perceived. So that's something to always understand, is you have to step into the mind of the offender in order to understand what's going on. The blanket versus tarp versus carpet is all just material that they have access to. It has no difference.
What about checking the contents of the trash bin? And was it just random fire, or was there something in there that was revealing?
So checking the contents of the trash bin, of course, that would be done. In this particular case, it's just random. He's using it just to burn the place down. So now you're starting to understand a little bit in terms of, we're not getting into the weeds about how to process a crime scene, but in terms of when you start looking at the aspects of the crime scene and reconstructing the events, and then starting to evaluate, well, what do these mean? Because the offender is coming in with a mindset, and then his actions and his emotions are going to be influenced what happens inside this particular crime scene. When you start to see this type of contradiction, victim number one versus covered versus the fire, Now you're dealing with an offender who's switching gears several times. This is telling me that this offender got frazzled.
Ultimately, this is all going to have to be documented.
Yes.
Are you doing this real time? And will it end up being discoverable at a later point should this case go to trial?
So in terms of the actual crime scene documentation, crime scene investigation, evidence collection, that all gets documented. In terms of this type of assessment, a lot of this assessment is done after the fact, once you get all the information, the forensic testing, the autopsy reports, and everything. I will sit down and I actually do a formal crime scene reconstruction that ends up becoming a formal document that I have testified to. But a lot of this also becomes something that as an investigator, you're evaluating mentally and not necessarily writing it down. It gives you just sort of a sense of what you think you're going to do and a direction that you want to go.
When do you look for an ID or identify who the people are? Before you assess the crime scene?
So when do I try to identify who the victims are? That's done as fast as we possibly can. And oftentimes that's coordinated with the coroner's office because we can't manipulate the bodies or pull out wallets or IDs without the coroner's office permission. But we need to know who they are as soon as possible. So that's all very dynamic as we're going through this.
Would this be considered premeditated because there's the axe is brought in there and this is a hotel room and then there's a knife?
Absolutely. I mean, do hotel rooms have axes in them? This person is showing intent as soon as they walk in, right? Yes.
I would think the person that with the axe, the killer, was left-handed because of the angle of the wound with the axe.
So left-handed versus right-handed?
Yeah.
You know, in terms of evaluating the cast-off patterns from something like a hatchet or an axe, you can kind of get the sense of how they're swinging it, but we would never try to correlate left-handed versus right-handed. It is something that we will acknowledge, but it's not a characteristic that we would use to, eliminate a particular person.
With so much contradiction and misdirection, how do you determine, for example, whether it's victim one or the covering of the victim that is the misdirection?
So how do you determine victim number one versus the covering of the victim? Well, the victim number one is very explicit. Anytime you start to see an offender write at a crime scene, he is trying to send a message, and that message is going to be very specific. Covering of the victim, most offenders aren't aware. It's almost an unconscious act that they're doing because they are just now taking care of their own internal emotional state. So that explicit versus that internal aspect kind of tells me, you know what, it's what they are trying to convey explicitly is what I'm going to be paying attention to in terms of whether or not it's staging or not.
Is there any possibility that the victim number one and the personal relationship could possibly be true? I know it's rare, but I was recently heard about a case from the 70s or 80s where a guy, he was stalking women, but he formed a personal relationship with them. He went on dates, and after they finally arrested him, they found out that he had killed 48 women.
Oh, wow.
So is something like this a possible serial killer, but a personal relationship as well?
You can always have that. That would be the unusual, obviously, but it's something that you would take into consideration.
Hi again.
Hi.
Is it possible for you to explain the blood pattern only because to me, it's not making sense? Because if she's there, I mean, look, almost like she slid down the wall perhaps, but then there's on the sidewall.
Sure. So from a reconstruction standpoint, you now have a victim that appears to receive her bleeding injuries initially while she's on the bed. She's somehow able to get away from that and ends up out in this space. She's got bleeding injuries. All the blood drips on the carpet are blood drips that are falling straight down, showing the extent of her movement. But then she's also now being forced back into this back corner. She's got blood saturating her hair, so when she gets pressed up against the wall while standing, she leaves that. But you also have blood stains down low. And there's a certain sequencing going on there, because you look at the location of that trash can as the offender left it. Could that trash can have been there while the victim is down low laying in that corner? No. So it's showing that that trash can was placed there after the combat occurred in that corner. So again, sequencing stuff.
Is it possible that the trash can wasn't misdirection, but that the offender actually wanted them to be found?
Well, when you think about the trash can, it was on fire. The contents inside were on fire at the time. That is a typical thing in which you're trying to burn down and get rid of evidence. So that is the last thing that this offender is doing. Now that offender is saying, I don't want to be caught, I want to destroy evidence.
So if they both got their first blow while they're in the bed, doesn't that mean that no one let them in the door? So it's either someone who has a key or can pick a lock?
It could be, absolutely.
What floor were they on?
What floor were they on?
She asked.
I'm looking at Lonnie right now. What floor were they on? It is important when you're assessing the location. What is the risk to the offender in terms of where he's carrying out this attack? As an example, Golden State Killer almost universally only went into single-story residences. And he's only attacking victims whose bedrooms were on that first floor. Why is he doing that? It's because if he goes upstairs to the second floor, where's his escape route? Back down those stairs. It's sort of like this tunnel of death. He can't bail out the second-story windows without harm to himself. But when he's on the first floor, he has multiple avenues to escape, and he would often do things such as prop sliding doors open and rearrange furniture to allow his escape to be easier, to be quicker. So if it is on the second floor, maybe there's a chance that it's a little bit more targeted in terms of who the victims are versus random.
What would you say the ratio is of somebody who committed this crime against somebody that they know and covered them up because they just don't want to see it anymore, or somebody who's in a cycle of committing crime, they just can't help themselves, but then feel shame that they're doing it, and so covering it up?
So in my experience, in the cases in which I've seen the victims covered up, it's always come back to somebody who is related to the victim. I think the individuals, the profilers from like the FBI's unit who see a broad perspective would be better able to answer that, maybe with more numbers of cases that they've been involved with.
Seems like they must have some remorse or something, even calling them a victim versus somebody who deserved what they got.
So the remorse aspect?
Using the word victim would seem to be saying that they did something bad to somebody, that these people deserve it.
Absolutely. And it does, I think that's a good point, is that it probably does indicate that there is a personal relationship. That is actually from a case that I was involved with, where the offender ended up stabbing the female. He had sexually assaulted her, and then wrote victim number 1 above her body in her blood, and then tried to use a candle to burn the place down. And it turned out that that offender was known to the victim and would frequent her apartment. Very close friendship, in fact. So very interesting from that perspective. And I think we're getting close to finishing this segment. Are there any last questions? It was in a hotel. Would somebody hear something?
I might notice if my neighbor was getting murdered. I don't know.
It all depends on how this went down, right? Victimology, is she a screamer? Was there a lot of loud thumps? So how often do you have commotion going on in your hotel room and you just go, oh, somebody's enjoying themselves? Where was that? Can we get her a mic? I can't hear her. I think this will be the last question, and I think we have to move on.
This is all so interesting, but how does it actually help you solve a case?
Because what it does is it provides investigative focus. So now I'm looking at this crime scene, and I've got a sense that the offender and the victim had some sort of relationship. Now I have focus versus it being just maybe a completely random case. So I'm going to put my energies where the evidence in the crime scene are telling me I need to go. So I think with that, we're going to end this segment. I want to make sure that everybody tunes in tonight. We have The Death at the Mansion, the death of Rebecca Zahau on Oxygen, second episode, so please